I just had a deep sense of dread of disappointing my Black family by being anything that was a stereotype or shameful, or perceived as shameful. I wanted to be the Martin Luther King of the family. I wanted to be the Barack Obama of the family. I think for me, the biggest surprise is the intersections of justice. That coming out deepened my experience and engagement with being a Black man. It deepened and enriched my experience with like poverty and oppressions and struggles and triumphs and beauty of humanity that exists and that is in a life and in a world. I'm much more connected with the world than I am disconnected with the world. Like when I was in the closet, I was so isolated, and I was around people who were so isolated, and it took so much energy to maintain isolated relationships with a narrow vision of what the human experience is.
Welcome to Grain Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. Wherever you are in your journey, I hope these stories will help you feel less alone. You can find additional episodes of Grain Rainbows at my website at grainrainbows.com. And please be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcasting app. If you want to send me feedback, write to me at grainrainbows@gmail.com. My guest today is Reverend Michael Crumpler. He is the LGBTQ and Multicultural Programs Director for the Unitarian Universalist Association. Recently, we've heard the stories of several people struggling for acceptance in conservative faith communities. Often these stories seem to end with leaving. So I wanted Michael to share his story because it has a very different ending. I'll be back after the interview to share a few closing thoughts and some brief announcements. Hi, Michael. It's great to have you on the show today.
Hi. Great to be here.
So, as we talked before we started recording, I usually like to ask people about their stories. In your case, I think I remember you saying that you've been out about 10 years and came out during your 30s. So recently I talked to somebody who had only been out less than a year. So I like to have people of different ages and different, you might say, places on the journey. So welcome. Where would you like to start your story?
I think that's a great place, actually. Coming out is always an interesting phenomenon, but I do date my coming out to be approximately 10 to 12 years ago. And I became most comfortable with publicly embracing the identity of in my case, a Black gay man. I was essentially at I think at a crossroads, which again, I don't think is uncommon for people coming out. I had been married for 7 years, and we, got a divorce when I came out, or I came out and we got a divorce. But it was basically at that intersection of my life. And also going on at that time was really just an overall existential crisis around what faith is, what ministry is. I had been in the formation process of becoming a minister, but never really having fully actualized it. And it was always because of my sexuality, or it was always this internal struggle with, oh my God, I'm going to become this minister and fail because I'm gay. Or, oh my goodness, if I come out as gay, I can't be a minister. So that was always just a rough wrestling, if you will. In my 30s, it was like, well, I'm definitely gay, and that's about the only thing I definitely am. And so let's lead with that.
What faith tradition did you grow up in?
I grew up in the South, so that probably says more about my faith tradition than the actual faith tradition. Grew up in the South, in North Carolina, I grew up in the Black church, and we were Baptist. We were specifically missionary Baptist. I mean, as a kid, that didn't mean much because there were a lot of churches and I didn't really know the difference between the two, except for that they were in different buildings. I didn't necessarily know growing up what the difference between a Christian or a Baptist or Pentecostal, because I knew everybody who went to all those kinds of churches, and we kind of it felt the same to me. What I thought about myself and thought about God was a hybrid of what my family thought and what the culture thought. So my family wasn't strictly religious. We used the term growing up saved. My household wasn't saved, which meant that nobody was in there toting the Bible or anything. But even in that secular environment, I knew that God didn't want me to be gay, or at least that was the inner sense of how I was understanding myself in religion.
So how did that change?
I actually think that it was the sexuality within my own sense of having a different sexuality that changed it, because the deep sense of insecurity that created in me, knowing that there was something in me that wouldn't make people happy, caused me to cling to religion a lot more. I wanted to be different than I was, which was basically the same as everybody else. I wanted to get married and have children, and that was kind of the model. And everybody who seemed gay or were gay was mocked and picked on and rejected. And I just didn't want that. And I think I made up my mind very early in my life that I would pursue normalcy at whatever cost. However, I knew that because I was in a very heavily Christianized space, God was the only force that could allow me to do all things, through Christ who strengthens me. So that was my own sense of religion and faith. God would give me the power to be the right kind of person that I'm supposed to be.
That obviously didn't turn out that way. So what happened next?
I grew up. I had a great childhood for the most part. I went to college. I went to college for a year. And then after a year, I joined the Air Force. I was in the military. And it was in the military where I essentially became very devoted. I was 20 years old, became a very devoted Christian. From there, I kind of moved away from my Southern Black church roots and kind of became more of an evangelical, cultural evangelical, if you will. And so I loved it. I became really involved with church and teaching the Bible, running ministry groups and doing evangelism. And I got into the politics of evangelical conservatism really, really strongly. And it all made sense to me because of this inner struggle that I was having with myself. So it was during that time that religion became more than just a prayer, praying to God for me not to be gay and to get married and have children, to oh my goodness, this is an ideology that I believe in, that I can connect to, because yes, everything about me is miserable. And that's essentially what evangelicalism helped me to understand. And it made me feel good because it was the opposite of what I was. And so in that belief system, that faith system, I was, an alternate version of who I was, which is what everyone affirmed. That was kind of my first pursuit of ministry. So I went to Bible college, and then I started seminary. I got married. It was really Bible college, marriage, then seminary. And it was sort of during those times, within marriage really, that it became clear to me that my sexuality was purely gay. It was just eye-opening. I mean, just being in a 24-hour, completely connected relationship with a woman, which is what I thought would overshadow my sexuality, just kind of seemed to make it more apparent and make it more real. So I, just became really, really unhappy in that marriage, and it was apparent. We decided to, obviously, it's not we woke up one day and said we wanted to divorce, but there were all kinds of problems. And out of all of those problems, for me, it just boiled down to, I'm just not the person that you think that I am. I'm not the person that I thought I could be. And this is just not working, and it's not healthy. So we got a divorce. And the divorce wasn't just from her. It was really from everybody and everything that was going on in my life at that time. It wasn't like I just got a divorce and kept my same friends and still went to church and still finished seminary and still became an Air Force chaplain. It was a divorce not only from her, but from everything that was kind of like, the way I understand it, reinforcing this lie that I'm going to hell if I'm gay and that I'm like an immoral person or a deviant or all of these things. Like, it was like once I detached myself from that relationship, all the other relationships sort of kind of crumbled as well. And for a few years there, in my early 30s, probably like from 30 to 35, I was sort of like in what I would describe, for lack of a metaphor besides a religious one, is like like a wilderness, where I didn't think that I could be a minister. And I didn't think that, it just all seemed like a sham or a fraud. And I wouldn't go as far as to say I didn't believe in God, but I certainly had a resentment. And I also felt so hurt and betrayed by everyone that I also didn't want to like make myself vulnerable to pursuing something like that again, only to find out that again. So I'm like, you know what? I'm never doing that again. I'm never going to lie again. I'm never going to be, I wouldn't say pressured, because pressured wasn't a thing. I'm never, ever, ever going to allow myself to be misled into some kind of like a faith tradition or belief that who I am is not enough. And with that, again, divorce or break from everything, it kind of created a deep sense of loneliness that also was unsatisfying. It's like, well, yeah, I'm out and I'm dating and I'm honest and I'm walking in my truth, but it's very lonely. And I miss all of these people that I spent 15 to 20 years getting to know. I miss my family that, I'm different, but I'm the same person. So there was also this like deep sense of like despair. Well, yeah, I'm out, but I'm certainly not happy. Whereas when I wasn't out, I did have some measure of happiness. I had a job, I had acceptance, I had, a house, a dog and 2 cats and a wife, and we had dinner together. And that, when I came out, just kind of, I was like living in Chicago and dating different people and going to bars. So I had no social political context either for what it meant to be. At this point, it's like 2005. I mean, there's not a lot of movement going on during that time, at least in the spaces where I was. And so there was a sense of loneliness. And so I eventually ended up visiting a church that was affirming, that was open and affirming, which is the term that we use in the United Church of Christ. It had a rainbow flag out front, and I just decided to go one Sunday. And I don't really know, there was nothing special about that Sunday. I just went. This was in 2011. Honestly, like halfway through the first, it felt so familiar and so freeing. Not just to be in a church again, but also to be in a church again with people who walked like me and talked like me and looked like me, as far as LGBTQ is concerned, as far as being gay is concerned. And I just knew right away that this is where I'm here to stay. I mean, it wasn't like I walked into church and decided to come to pursue ordination. That wasn't it. There was something like almost miraculous. I felt like I was resurrected over a very short period of time. Like I'm talking 6 to 9 to 18 weeks to 6 months. Like I felt like theologically, I kind of came together. All the things resonated. All of the sermons resonated. The music resonated. All of it had color. Somehow, some way, like life was breathed into it. And it just kind of became my most cherished thing. I was there every time the doors opened. I joined, became a member. I began teaching Sunday school. And nagging in the back of me was like, oh my God, this is what I've always loved, except I can be completely honest about who I am. And it was around that time that I think, I'd come out a few years before then, but not only was I out, I was like fulfilled. And so I reapplied to seminary and decided to pursue that to finish getting my Master of Divinity.
So I'm curious, it sounds like at one time you were very embedded in a very conservative view of Christianity that is very unaffirming. How did you make that transition intellectually? I mean, obviously you felt it in your heart. Was there an intellectual component to it?
Yes, I would say there's an intellectual component and there's an academic component. So the academic component is certainly key, but the intellectual part, I think, for me, had a lot more to do with the existential crisis that I had experienced. So during that time, I also became HIV positive. What happened there was like, in my experience and engagement with friends, essentially, like with friends from church or ministry colleagues, what I experienced was a lack of empathy and compassion in our relationship that made it much easier to like make that intellectual leap. And there's enough of faith that does translate between conservative and liberal. It's not like I'm moving from like Islam to Buddhism. There's enough touch points, like Jesus is still Jesus, who's like justice-minded, healing, loving. There's enough touch points there where I didn't feel like I had to relearn things, but it was like turning a coin over on its head, if you will. It was a lot of work to twist the scriptures into, or the theology into this mold of conservatism. Becoming a liberal just made it less work. Like, oh, like it doesn't matter if the Bible is the word of God or if it's the word of, there were certain things that I didn't have to fight for. Whereas before I was like, it is the word of God. God wrote it and it fell out of the sky. Whereas like, does anything get written and falls out of the sky? Like all of a sudden the things that I were fighting for, I slowly began to realize that wasn't where the battle is won. Like it's love and it's empathy, and people are sophisticated and complex. And once I began to like accept that for myself, I was able to then accept that for others.
So what was the biggest surprise along the way?
I think for me, the biggest surprise is the intersections of justice. That coming out deep in my experience and engagement with being a Black man, it deepened and enriched my experience with like poverty and oppressions and struggles and triumphs and beauty of humanity that exists and that is in a life and in a world. I'm much more connected with the world than I am disconnected with the world. Like when I was in the closet, I was so isolated, and I was around people who were so isolated, and it took so much energy to maintain isolated relationships with a narrow vision of what the human experience is. And so once I came out, I feel like I'm so much more connected with the universe, really, but certainly like a global experience of like humanity. And I'm just able to just be more free around people and be more open to people. And the idea of being this closeted minister, ministering to a very narrow community of people who believe things one way, I just can't fathom that anymore. It's like beyond my comprehension. And I mean, that's even before like the moment that we're in. And I am just so glad that I don't know where I'd be like right now, like with COVID and Black Lives Matter and marriage equality and all of the 50 years after Pride and even like the Trump era. Like it horrifies me that had I not gone through this shift, if you will, 10 years ago, where I would be right now. It would just blow my mind. And I know that I'm smart enough to know that I would never say that, oh, I would never think that way, or I could never think that way. It just would be horrifying. And so that to me is the biggest surprise, just how open my life is as opposed to how it used to be, and not just the rawness of being gay, which is also a lot of fun.
So you feel like you're able to see in other people the things we have in common instead of trying to put us in these narrow us and them types of boxes?
I would say the things we have in common and the things we don't have common, and also appreciating the things that we don't have in common, like, and also fighting for those things. Like, I'm not trans, but I will put my body on the line for it. I'm not an undocumented immigrant, but I will throw down for immigration reform and the full inclusion of people who want to live here. I am not a woman, but I am wholeheartedly committed to reproductive justice. I am not a heroin addict, but I believe heavily in harm reduction. And so all of the things that, like, whereas as a conservative, I would have had an argument against a person based upon an ideology, as opposed to now I have an argument and a fight and a commitment regardless of experience and ideology.
I'm going to break in here to remind you of a couple of things. First, be sure to email me if you want an invitation to join our new private group on MeWe. We have moved the group from Facebook for better privacy for those who need it. My email is grainrainbows@gmail.com. Also, if you find Grain Rainbows helpful, I hope you will share it with others and consider supporting the show via Patreon at patreon.com/Grain Rainbows, spelled with an A. Patreon allows you to make a monthly pledge that fits your budget. Even $1 a month will help defer the expenses of creating this show. The largest ongoing expense is audio editing. Your help is greatly appreciated. Michael, do you have the opportunity to help other people that are still struggling with the coming out process as an adult?
Yes. Well, I mean, again, the world has changed in the last 10 to 15 years in a lot of ways, to where we're all kind of connected much more, like through Facebook, frankly, and social media. And so I stay in touch with people that I knew in a very thin way. And I'm very visible in my role with the Unitarian Universalist Association. I'm very vocal. I write, I speak, I teach, I lead, so on the one hand, folks who knew me know who I am and where I am and what I believe and what I'm doing. And what was a very traumatic public divorce, it's experienced and I think viewed as a journey. So in that way, which is passively, I would say, I think youth, I do have young family members that I experience as struggling with coming to terms with their sexuality. And I stay close to them and be available to them and live my life in a way that is, I wouldn't say a model or an example, but certainly with transparency. Like, I have a partner and he's my boyfriend and he comes home with me to visit family. So there is a way in which I live my life as an opportunity, as I should say. And then I think sexuality is very complex. And so I don't know if coming out, the in-out, the in the closet, out of the closet paradigm really works with a lot of people. I think that most people are on a journey. And I know the first time I told someone I was gay, I was 19. And then then again when I was 22, and then again when I was 27. So it wasn't like, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, you never know really where anyone is with being out or being in. Some people are out as far as their sexuality is concerned, but their lives are filled with a lot of turmoil and insecurity. And then there are people whose lives are super secure and they have all the answers and they're married and internally there's just a lot of turmoil. I try to engage sexuality as like this thing that we're all always struggling with all the time, whether it's sex addiction or gender dysphoria or racism in the queer community. All of these things impact folks' safety as it relates to being authentic.
Right. So what's safe for one person in terms of how out to be publicly might not be safe for somebody else. And one of the things that I really appreciate when I get to have, much older guests on the show is they can, make younger listeners aware that being publicly out as the norm is a relatively new phenomenon, very new, really.
Mm-hmm. Very, very new.
So do you mind addressing the whole issue of being a Black gay man? Because I have a feeling that it's might be even more challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't guess because that is like, the joy of my life these days. I would speak less to it being challenging as it is, as much as it is multi-layered. Because a lot of why I didn't want to come out is because I was the oldest son of a single mother who had her own challenges. And also like the very intellectual, intelligent kid in a large family that also had like a lot of social and systemic challenges. I just had a deep sense of dread of disappointing my Black family by being anything that was a stereotype or shameful, or perceived as shameful. I wanted to be the Martin Luther King of the family. I wanted to be the Barack Obama of the family. I wanted to be that figure in our family. And I felt not only is that what I wanted me to be, but that's what everyone else wanted me to be. Now, it's quite possible that every other Black man in my family felt that. Maybe they had other internal compromises and struggles that made them get that way. Maybe it's something that all Black men have, but I really had it. And it wasn't just about, so I'm never going to be gay. It was other things. So I'm never going to drop out of high school. I'm never going to go to jail. I'm never going to be homeless. I'm never going to not have there was a variety of I'm never going to not do because I'm Black. And if I do those things, then I'll become the stereotype. Being gay was one of those things. And that's where the challenging part comes in. But like I said, it was multi-layered. And that's where it kind of becomes complicated. And I also think that like the LGBTQ narrative is so white that those of us who are not white have a hard time finding ourselves in that story. Being white and going to college and having sex in a dorm with a man or woman, and then going back home to your parents and sitting down with them at Thanksgiving and coming out, and then they reject you and you run to New York or San Francisco and fight for your rights and use your like privilege to like sway the thinking of the multitudes of people just because you're happy and have a dog and a boyfriend. That narrative is so dominant in the media and in the movies. There's just no other story for anyone else to tell. And so I think a part of being Black multi-layered or challenging or difficult even is just finding yourself. And I know that like a lot of us, me included, get lost in trying to please or capture the attention of white men in order to be a part of that dominant, compelling narrative that seems to be the only way that we can convince people that we're human.
I appreciate you sharing that because I never would have really thought. What was the name of that? I watched a movie recently and I'm blanking on the name of it, but I bet you've seen it. It is the story of a young boy growing up in Miami. Do you remember the name of that movie?
Moonlight.
Moonlight, yeah. Of course, it doesn't have a happy ending, but it's very realistic.
Yeah, I mean, it was so good that I think I was so happy at the end that it felt like a happy ending. I was on the floor the night that it won the Oscars for a variety of reasons, because even the way that the Oscar was won was just so typical of how we feel as queer people of color. The spotlight is always elsewhere and we're always overshadowed. Our beauty always kind of like sneaks up at the end. It was just amazing. So I love the movie. And what I love about that narrative is that it is a unique narrative. I don't know if anybody can say that's exactly what happened to me. I was embraced by by that narrative in and of itself is very unique. What makes it relatable is its uniqueness. Because I don't have a model that I don't have a narrative that anyone else can relate to and identify with. And the only identifiable part is that it's different. And someone else might be like, oh my God, I had an experience too that was completely different than everybody else's.
Yeah, everybody's story is different, but then there's always places where they connect. Now, you didn't have any children with your wife, is that correct?
No, we didn't.
Yeah. So how's your relationship with your family now?
I think my relationship with my family is expensive because of the therapy. My relationship with my family is I would say really, really good. The way we perceive our family and the way they perceive ourselves and what they're going through at the same moment that we're going through any kind of traumas has a lot to do with our experience. And so they really, really respect me. I feel very respected. It's like when you watch a TV series and like you're just focused on the episodes that you're watching, you can kind of make connections. But I feel like when they see me, they see who I am today without really a lot of, I would say they probably have wonderings, but I wouldn't say a lot of curiosity that gets in the way of relationships. And I think that there are people that, you know, are like, don't understand homosexuality or the work that I'm doing. But there are also people that don't understand justice work on a whole in my family. I think that that's okay. I also am of service to them in a lot of ways. I mean, my mom died a couple of years ago, so there's been a lot of grief around that. 2 years before that, my older sister passed away. She left behind a son who I've become almost a father figure to, but just ensuring his success. I'm realizing that whatever you thought the future was going to be about or people would be like whenever you came out, I just see that, like, I never thought that my mom would have been, you know, she wasn't an elderly lady, and that my mom wouldn't be alive today, and that my sister wouldn't be alive today. And so that changes everything as it relates to sexuality. I've seen people treat me a lot differently because my mom's not around, or even when she was around. So we're a family. I'm not always comfortable with my sexuality in their presence, but they know I'm gay and I know I'm gay, and I'm not going to change that anymore because of them.
Do you think attitudes in the, I know the Black community is not a monolithic thing, but do you think the attitudes of the Black community are changing toward LGBTQ people?
So I actually think that the attitudes of the alleged hostility that the Black community is supposed to have towards the LGBTQ community is overinflated. I actually think that there's a little bit of myth to the narrative that the Black community is hostile to LGBTQ. I believe that, like, well, white supremacy is the denominator to all anti-racist, anti-oppressive, multicultural, white supremacy is that. And so I think that, like, it's hard to have a conversation around Black hostility to queerness and transness without also talking about white supremacy. I think that because of progress, that all communities are having to reckon with where LGBTQ people fit in, whether you're Catholic or Black or Latino or immigrant or Native American. I think that all communities have to grapple with it. And I think that Black people are finding the courage to be more honest about Black queer people. I find the courage to be more honest with our families. I just think that, like, the church has always had queer people in it who were allowed to function and be, whereas in white spaces, you were not allowed to be queer at all when I was an evangelical. Like, you couldn't even pretend, you couldn't even have a conversation. Like, it was like such a fascist practice around anything that was different. Whereas in Black spaces, there was a fight, but you could stay in the room. You could stay in the neighborhood. You could stay in the house. There was never really this, like, total abandonment. So I think that, like, the conversation around anti-LGBTQ in the Black community is a lot more sophisticated.
Well, Michael, I've really enjoyed talking with you. I feel like we are for sure leaving out a lot of stuff, but we got off to a good, conversation. I got to hear a perspective that obviously I don't usually get to be exposed to, so I really appreciate that. One of the things that a lot of my guests have talked about is their struggle with guilt. How has that influenced your journey?
I experienced myself as lucky in that, like, I was married We didn't have children. Most of who I hurt was myself. I've gone through a lot of recovery from like self-hate and addiction that were a part of my coming out journey, like the party scene and all of that, that really helps me on an interpersonal way with feelings of guilt and shame and self-harm and those kinds of things. And even in that, I'm lucky. I think that, like I said, being queer is very, very multi-layered, and there are so many different communities and sub-communities and kinks and fetishes, ways of being within the queer community that, I mean, there's polyamory, there's open relationships, there's so many pockets that we all kind of like find ourselves moving and being and experiencing. And of course, there's faith and activism and ACT UP and all of the different. And I just find myself really grateful that I've been on this journey, been able to have a lot of space for self-care. And like I said, therapy, and I was adopted in a spiritual sense, if you will, by really good people who pointed me in different directions, whether it be where to go to seminary or where to find a job or where to like serve on a board or attend a committee meeting or who to go to a rally with. Like I've also been very, very blessed with really healthy people and probably an abundance of riches in that regard to help. And I'm very aware that that's not everyone's experience. And I think that people who struggle with guilt and shame, I find that to be the common denominator, is that there's just a deficit of really healthy people.
And a lot of people that don't live in, you live in New York now and you lived in Chicago before, but if you live in a small rural place in the South, for example, your ability to connect with others is much more limited. And I think, and of course, that's even worse right now. Before we close, would you tell me, since we met at the Unitarian Universalist Association General Assembly virtually recently, would you tell me a little bit about what you do with UUA?
Oh, yes. So I am the LGBTQ and Multicultural Programs Director at the Unitarian Universalist Association, which is the National Office of Unitarian Universalism. So a big part of that job is working with congregations to ensure that they're welcoming, that when someone like me walks through the door, that there are programs and education in place that has already been done so that the queer person coming into a Unitarian Universalist congregation for the first time can feel safe, and not just safe, but affirmed and welcomed. And so we call that the Welcoming Congregations Program. And so I oversee that process, that congregations are current, that they're up to date, also that they have resources and materials and curriculum that they're being taught about trans identity, queer homelessness, intersexuality, so all of the different things that the community needs to know, or that a faith community ought to know about our community. I do that work. That's part of the work. I also do anti-racist work, dismantling white supremacy work. I support religious professionals of color within our congregation I don't lead the retreat, but I certainly plan and execute it annually, and also offer other professionally enriching experiences for that particular congregation. So yeah, I have a social media platform and a blog and those kinds of things as well.
And I guess that in recent months, you've been doing most of your work virtually.
Yes, which honestly, a lot of my work is done virtually anyway. It's either virtual work or like retreats and traveling to visit folks on location. So that's the part that's really, the virtual has increased. So now everything is virtual and the travel has decreased. So if there's a conference or a retreat or a meeting in a particular city or an action or social action in a particular place, obviously those aren't happening right now. And that was a lot of my jobs. I was either doing things virtually or traveling. And it was like about 50-50. And so now it's mostly virtual, which is great. For me, I love it. I don't love the reason why it's virtual, but I do like that it's virtual.
Michael, is there anything else you'd like to share before we close?
We are in a pandemic. And, I wouldn't want to end on this like, I love everything virtual. I just want to, the hearts of people are on my heart. And I'm wondering what it must be like for people who are in process. The pandemic happened to land at a time in my life where I'm pretty stable. I'm in a healthy relationship. My needs are met. I have a roof over my head, clothes on my back, food on my table. My purpose is not in doubt as far as like who I am and what I'm supposed to be doing right now. I'm constantly aware of that's not where everyone is at, whether it be health or emotional or physically. And so I just remind us to think about those folks who are struggling with all the things that I've come through, but the timeline happens to be a little uncooperative right now, and just wishing folks the best.
Right. I got an email recently from somebody in Australia who said that they had just come out and quit their job. I think it was in some kind of faith community. They'd quit their job, come out, and their plan was to travel. Yeah. Now they are basically stuck. So I know that that's not an isolated thing, and I'm with you. Every day I feel huge gratitude for all the things that I have. Even though I don't have a partner, I do have my golden retriever to keep me from being lonely. And, my life is stable. I'm with you. Our hearts go out to these people who are in places that, they can't do what they need to do. And
hopefully it will just inspire us all to work toward a more equitable world, because people shouldn't, we're not in the medieval times where whatever befalls a person in hardship, like I'm thinking of like some proverb right now of like, we're better than that. Folks should be able to survive and succeed without pain and like unnecessarily. I mean, I think the pandemic is hard enough. Like catching COVID should be about the only thing that we're worried about, but all these other things that become kind of like tangential problems, like healthcare and employment and housing and food and therapy and clothing, like those things shouldn't have to like be a struggle as much as they are for people.
Yeah, especially in a world where so many of us have much more than we really need.
Exactly.
Well, I hope that by next year we might be able to meet in person. But I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Yeah, for sure. And I hope to do so again.
I want to thank Michael Crumpler for sharing his story with us today. One thing that really impressed me was his comment that being out allows him to be much more open to the world. This means being open to everything, including beauty and the need to pursue justice. He mentioned both beauty and depression, as well as his grief about losing his sister and his mother. I'm looking forward to working with Michael to make Graying Rainbows a resource for helping create more welcoming congregations. I'd love to get your feedback. You can write to me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. You can post voice feedback at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. And you can also post to the Graying Rainbows fan page on Facebook. You can find additional episodes of Graying Rainbows on our website, grayingrainbows.com. Graying Rainbows comes out the first Friday every month, and you can subscribe for free in your favorite podcasting app. You can now also get show notes automatically if you sign up for my newsletter. Just follow the link in the show notes or text Graying Rainbows, spelled with an A and no space between graying and rainbows. Text Graying Rainbows to 33777. We now have a private group on MeWe. Be sure to email me if you want an invitation to join. We've moved the group from Facebook for better privacy for those who need it. Also, if you find Graying Rainbows, I hope you will share it with others and consider supporting the show via Patreon at patreon.com/Graying Rainbows. Patreon allows you to make a monthly pledge that fits your budget. And even $1 a month will help make a difference. Finally, don't forget that I'm always looking for people who are willing to share their stories. You can do this in the privacy of the MeWe group or more publicly by being a guest or having your email read on the show. As Jen Grace reminded us in episode 39, there is probably at least one person out there who will benefit from hearing your story. So whenever you're ready, just email me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. I'll be back next month with another episode of Graying Rainbows. Until then, I hope you will check out my other podcasts, Books and Ideas, and Brain Science. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Graying Rainbows is copyright 2020 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com.